Okay, let's look at some cool particle and volumetric effects. We have our scene open here and our EV window as well. And the first thing we want to do is add a cube. So I'm just going to shift a mesh cube. This will be our domain to encapsulate all of our particles and our volumetric effects. So let's scale it up to pretty much cover the scene here. Here we go. Covers everything. You might want to apply the scale. Just, good habit to have. And then let us set up a new material so we can see the volumetric effect in action. So let's call it effects. And we want to switch our principal BSDF to volume. So we can do Shift S, switch shader, principal volume. Doesn't plug it into the right output here, into the right input. So let's correct that. Can't see much, it's all gray, but that is because we need to drive our density a little bit. So you can see, if we turn our density down, you can kind of see the effect it's going for. So let's drive our density with a Voronoi texture. I like to switch on the material preview here just so when we do Control Shift click, we can kind of see a 2D representation on this surface of the texture we're going to get. So let's plug that into density. Let's introduce a gamma. Just to soften that effect a bit. Play with the scale a bit more. Okay, cool. Let's change the color. Nice. It really feels like a kind of medium we're moving through. And might introduce a point light. Let's move it back along the Y. Just see what that looks like. Cool. If you are also playing back and you are getting a lot of flicker, you might need to switch off viewport denoising, which kind of has this effect, which is not particularly desirable when you're playing back stuff. So let's just uncheck that for the time being. That's cool. Okay, let's animate this into a sort of smoky effect. And to do that, we're going to adjust the vector here. And we're going to use a noise texture to drive it. So with our Voronoi selected, let's Control T to hook up a mapping node. And then use our color output for location. It's already kind of cool, but we might want to reduce the effect slightly. Let's get a mix RGB, multiply, restrict the effect by choosing black for color 2 and have a full factor. Then we can see it, we can kind of turn up the effect a bit. Okay, cool. Now let's have the Voronoi texture be as if it's sort of a sort of steam rising effect. So let's introduce a vector math node. Just put it just before the mapping on location, and now we can move it up and down. So we kind of want it to move up. So let's use a driver to animate this one, so we don't have to be messing about with keys too much. Add driver. Expression, we're going to go frame. We're going to delete the variable down here. Cool. Now that effect is happening rather fast. So we need to divide it by a lot. Something like that. Okay. But it's happening in the wrong direction. So one final little adjustment is let's times it by -1. All right, now we're moving in the right direction. Again, just the tiniest bit too fast. Go to 550, and that's it. I won't touch it anymore. No more tweaking. Perfect. Looking good. Now let's introduce some nice particle elements. So we're going to use the same cube, but this time we're going to create a particle system. keep it on emitter. You can see a representation of the particles here. So we don't want these halo dots. We want our own particles to catch the light in interesting ways. So I'm just going to shift right click over here to create a new origin point for our cursor. And I'm going to create mesh icosphere and tap the period or full stop on the number pad to just jump in. And then Shift D and duplicate that, let's say 3 times. And if we go over to the add modifier, we can add a decimate and turn it down and link everything else up to that modifier. Just give them slightly different values as well. And I'm going to go in and just sort of just mess around a little bit with these. Just give them slightly different shapes, but that looks good. So let's apply the decimate effect modifier on all of these. And with them all selected, hit M on the keyboard and move to a collection called, let's call it dust. Okay. So now what we can do, back to our cube here, under the particles, or checking here, we can jump over to our particle system. And on render, we don't want halo, we want the collection dust. And let's crank up these numbers a little bit too. I'm gonna go frame end at 2 and just add a few zeros there. So we got a lot of particles, but they're all from full. They all emit from the surfaces and they all fall due to gravity. So let's just quickly fix that by having the source be volume and field weights, gravity, no effect. All right. So doesn't last very long. That's not good. Let's increase our lifetime. Let's go to 200. Let's also give a material to these and just call it dust. I'm just going to sort of crank up the metallic and down the roughness a bit just so there's more kind of catch lights. And let's just select the other ones, link over materials. Back to our particle simulation. Let's do a little bit of randomness to the scale here and turn down the scale so we just sort of pick up little bits here. So let's jump back to our material. I'm going to turn down the base a bit, but crank up the emission so we really have things, particulate matter to see. Something like that would be cool. And if we synchronize that with our camera's depth of field, let's introduce some depth of field. Just also going to switch on limits here so we can see the focus point. And turn down our f-stop. And this will be dependent on how the scale of your scene, but you know, tweak it to your heart's content. Now we have a nice kind of aqua soup to sort of move through, which is nice. And just to add even more dynamism to it, let's add an empty first. Let's snap our cursor to world origin, add an empty. It doesn't really matter shape-wise. And with our empty, we're going to use force field, turbulence. There it is. Again, this is kind of trial and error, but to get some nice sort of swelling type effects. And for a final bit of post-production, we're actually going to add a vignette in camera So if we select our camera, snap cursor to selected, let's add a mesh, a plane, rotate it X 90, move it along the Y here, scale it up just a bit, switch over to material, let's call it Vignette. Let's also select it, then select our camera. She might need to hide the particles, and then Control P, parent to object, so that we move with the camera. Let's unhide all of our cool effects. Back to the material for our vignette, making sure we have blend mode, alpha blend selected. Base color, nothing, no specular. And we want a gradient texture, again on spherical, that factor can go into our alpha. Let's just isolate that so we have the inverse going on, but again down in the bottom right hand corner. So let's throw an invert on it. And a Control T, everything at 0.5. Point type to texture. And let us do a color ramp as well, so we can kind of tweak the effect. Like that. If the surrounding element is distracting, we can always select our camera, and in this option here we can just crank it up to 0.99 or something. Very cool. Let's go back to our material. Adjust the vignette a little more. Cool. And there are a few final tweaks here. We can jump over to color management, use curves, and just dial in a little bit of a look. And for that slight kind of vintage look, I'm just going to restrict the blue channel a bit. Nice. Okay, with that dialed in, we're going to go up to our motion blur, switch that on. Cool, I'm really happy with how this is coming together. In the next video, we will be looking at how to animate the camera procedurally, as well as adding a kind of exposure boost effect to really accentuate that explosion of letters.